So I don't think it's going to come as much of a surprise to you that Threshold is widely considered one of the worst episodes of Star Trek ever made.
Okay, I don't know if I necessarily agree, but I can see that. I mean, I assume that comes from the same school of thought that Spock's Brain is one of the worst episodes of, but I don't know. I was with Threshold for most of it. If it was a nothing special Brannon Braga body horror episode, it was everything that's happening to Tom Paris is horrible. If the actor doesn't do as great of a job being this creature version of Paris, whatever, when the Doctor is explaining what's happening, those parts are appropriately horrifying. Hearing that, his organs are liquefying, he has new organs. It was really the last 5 minutes when you have lizard babies that I think it began to go off the rails.
Absolutely. I think that I'm with you, that I don't necessarily think that Threshold is one of the worst episodes of Star Trek ever made. I could probably list 20 episodes that I think are worse. And primarily because I don't necessarily think that the first 20 to 30 minutes of this episode are that bad. And really what it comes down to, like you said, is that last 5 minutes of the episode, and specifically the scene when Tuvok and Chakotay beam down to the planet and find the salamander catfish people, animatronic people that are also having CGI babies. And we used to talk a lot in the original series about whether or not it was camp, and I think that you said it was camp a lot more than I did. I don't necessarily think that a lot of TOS is camp, but I definitely think that part of the tone problem with Threshold is the last 5 minutes, because I think that you could probably put the last 5 minutes of this episode in the Wikipedia entry on camp, and everyone would understand exactly what camp was at that point. And it's not even just Tuvok and Chakotay finding the babies. It's also that weird scene with Janeway and Paris at the end of the episode in Sick Bay.
I have to say, I kind of appreciate that, because we became lizards, we had lizard sex, I laid eggs, and they had babies in 3 days. Is a really weird conversation with a lot of baggage into it. When you're just dealing with two people, let alone a captain and her subordinate. So I like that Janeway kind of just plows ahead and has this horribly awkward conversation, because it's never going to be less awkward. There is no less awkward version of this conversation to have. We just need to rip the Band-Aid off, make 2 jokes about it, and then just agree to forget about this for the rest of the series. Otherwise, it'll be a thing.
Right, and I think all that's right, but
I still cringed watching the scene.
Right, like, why make this episode? And I think that's really what it comes down to, is that, the last scene is weird, the last scene is uncomfortable. It may be a good idea, it may be not be a good idea in a universe where Janeway and Paris turned into salamander catfish people and had babies together, that they need to have a conversation about it and put it to bed. But I think that what it really comes down to for me is, like, what the fuck was Brannon Braga thinking with this? Yeah. And I fundamentally do not know.
In a lot of ways, this is that one of the very first Brannon Braga episodes, the one with Geordi, where he becomes a lizard and he's trying to figure out what's going. Like, that was this is a retelling of that episode, but one that's not nearly as good, and one that doesn't even have as clear of a point.
Yeah, I don't know what the point of this episode is, and I think that if it's just to showcase Tom Paris and to showcase what's his name, Robert Duncan McNeil's acting abilities, I mean, let's be charitable and say that that's a fine idea, even though I don't know that he's necessarily the most well-versed actor on the show.
I was going to say, if they wanted to show off his acting abilities, they this was not the way, but
yeah, especially in the next episode when you have Tim Russ doing such an amazing job of an emotional Vulcan, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Yeah, I mean,
when you have Tim Russ doing an emotional Vulcan and Brad Dourif being
we'll talk about that. but I think that what it comes down to for me is that Brannon Braga seems very interested in the idea of evolution. I mean, I had forgotten about I hadn't forgotten about it, but in context of this conversation, I certainly had the episode where Geordi does become a lizard person, and with that Romulan subplot. I think, what was it, Identity Crisis, I think it was called. And then the 7th season episode of TNG, which was very focused on the idea of the crew de-evolving, and which, is bullshit, frankly. That, I mean, I guess that could happen. It's more it's more scientifically consistent to have a previous version of a species come to light than to have a logical endpoint of evolution, because that's not how evolution works. And I don't necessarily look to Star Trek for scientific accuracy. That's not why I'm watching the show. But I think there are certain plot elements or certain themes that I think that, Star Trek Discovery should stay away from. And I think that it's time travel and I think that it's evolution. Oh, yeah. I don't want to see Star Trek ever do anything with those again, because it's just incomprehensible gobbledygook most of the time.
I guess, this concept of evolutionary levels and de-evolving, or we're going to speed up evolution, this is a hokey sci-fi trope. And yes, I guess its use is so against how evolution works. I'm not even remotely an evolutionary scientist, and yet I know this is evolution is in response to environment.
Why do you call yourself Dr. Goodness?
Because it gets me laid. Evolution is in response to environment. It's not as if you have an endpoint and then you pick your perfect environment, as is the case here. Yes, creatures living on this swamp planet at the end of this probably would evolve to deal with warmer temperatures, moister environments, more of a amphibious nature. Sure, that would happen, but Tom Paris is doing his evolution on a spaceship. He would, if we can agree that yes, warp 10 speeds up the evolution of your body. Let's pretend that we have to accept even that much. Well, he would be evolving in response to the perfect being to live on this spaceship.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I would actually, that would have been a more interesting episode. I think, oh
my God, the symbolism of this. Voyager is our new home, and we are changing to live on Voyager, just as the Maquis and Starfleet are learning to work together. They are changing to live on Voyager.
Yeah, I'm not usually with you when you fix episodes, but I think that is such a good idea that I wish that episode had been Threshold, because I don't know what Brad Braga was interested in here, and I don't know why he thought this was a good idea. And I'm not, at some point, I don't think I want to do it right now. At some point, we're going to have to grapple with Brad Braga as a writer. Maybe when we get to Enterprise, that will be the time to go. Maybe when he takes over showrunning duties on Star Trek Voyager in season 5, maybe it's a good opportunity, because there's a certain degree of he's
got his one episode, and he's written it many times, and he's written it very well several times, but we're getting diminishing returns on it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of that Geordi episode. One of the standout scenes of that is when he's using the holodeck to recreate the scene, and it's, okay, well, what's that shadow? All right, adjust for that. And it's a terrifying and wonderful scene. Did he write Schisms as well?
I believe he did, yes.
Yeah, and that scene when they're recreating, oh no, it was more like a drill, oh no, it was a table. He does these set pieces that are really tense, that ratchet it up when they're slowly figuring out what exactly is going on, and we don't have anything like that in this episode, so it isn't even a good Brannon Braga episode. Yes, the body horror elements of it are appropriately terrifying and gross and creepy.
Well, I agree with that, but also frankly, in terms of a character to pick to have turn into a lizard person, why is it Tom Paris? I think it's Tom Paris only because he hasn't had an episode in a while.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you're feeling about Tom Paris, but I don't fundamentally care about him, and I don't really find him very interesting. And so this episode does nothing to make me find him more interesting. It's a showcase for a, charitably speaking, again, not the best actor on the show, who has to try and pull off something that is very difficult and doesn't really do a great job with it. And also, he is just stuck in sickbay for most of the episode, which is also fundamentally uninteresting. And I'm with you. Brannon Braga is a good writer. I think Brannon Braga gets a bad rap. I don't think Brown and Braga was everything that was wrong with Star Trek. I think that's lazy criticism. There were a lot of problems with especially Enterprise, and I don't think that Voyager or Enterprise are as bad as people say they are. And also, I don't necessarily think that they're bad, quote unquote. But to me, it's like at some point you have to say, okay, you're doing the same thing over and over again. You're writing the same episode over and over again, and you're just not that interested in making it new or making it dynamic because I guess you're betting that people haven't seen it before. And this is just really, really bad. Like I think that the payoff at the end of Identity Crisis or the payoff at the end of Schisms are not that interesting. But that's not the point. The episodes have a mood. The episodes have a focus. The episodes kind of have these really, really well-constructed set-piece scenes that work very well. What does this episode have? It does not have anything. It has Tom Paris turning into a lizard person and shaking in sickbay. That's just not very interesting to watch.
Yeah, and especially at the end, if you want to have... I guess it also feels very undercut by the fact that the ultimate form of humanity is the salamander catfish. I mean, it's a letdown, right? If you're going to use this episode to show me something really creepy that humanity is going to evolve into, and it's that.
Yeah, like why and why and especially in a franchise where the logical endpoint of evolution has always been energy beings.
Yes.
Why is he not turning into an energy being? Like there's so many different ways that you could take this, and it just speaks to a fundamental, I think, lack of imagination. and again, I've never been a staff writer on a television show. I generally don't know how hard it is to write a lot of episodes for a television show. I'm sure it's very difficult. And, I think Brown and Braga has written 6 episodes so far this season or something like that. So he's probably pretty tired already.
Well, that's the thing. This is one of those, out of 26 episodes, 6 of them may just be, we need to fill this in. Brandon Braga could probably write this episode on autopilot. It is, in a way, it's a lazy, what?
I think he did write it on autopilot.
Yeah. I need an episode. We need a script. Okay. Evolutionary levels, lizards. Oh, warp, pick a grab bag of 3-4 terms and just vomit out a script. I mean, this may be something he just did over an evening just because he needed one.
Well, I think that's right because, if I look at this episode and I say, what went wrong with it? I think for me, it fundamentally speaks to the idea of there was a concept here. There was a core idea that was interesting. But Brown and Braga either did not know what to do with it or did not have enough time to develop an interesting story to hang this around. And I think that the idea of, okay, we've got this absolute speed limit in Star Trek that was established, in TNG. No ship can go faster than warp 10. What would that mean? We also had transwarp technology established way back in, I think it was Star Trek. What was the first appearance of the USS Excelsior? Was that Star Trek 2? I don't remember. But
I have no idea.
Maybe it was. I think it was Star Trek 3 actually. With the mustachioed guy who was very like, we're going to take this ship out on a journey, and then they stole it or whatever. No, what's his name? Scotty sabotaged the engines in Star Trek 3 so he couldn't go after them when they were stealing the Enterprise. That ship had transwarp technology. Turns out that it didn't work, but that's another thing. So you kind of get this idea, okay, this is an interesting idea. This is extrapolating out something in Star Trek that has been established for a long time. I'm with you. I think the first 10, 15 minutes of the episode are really interesting. They're solving this problem. It's exciting. Even to the point where the episode starts out in that fake out with Tom Paris in the holodeck. And you think, obviously once the ship explodes, they're not going to kill Tom Paris in the opening of an episode in season 2. But it does have all those hallmarks of an inspired Brown and Braga opening. And then it just goes off the rails.
Well, here's the thing. I'm much more interested in the implications of warp technology than I am with evolutionary levels. I mean, there is that conversation where Janeway's saying, this is going to change our very existence, and it is true. If warp 10 exists in this way where they can exist in any point and appear at any point, then that makes distance utterly irrelevant. That is going to entirely change civilization as every civilization knows it. This is a singularity moment, and the episode very neatly ignores elides any stakes that it builds up in that line, which it does build up some very strong and evocative stakes in that line, but overrides them very easily by saying, oh, well, even if you can do it, it's going to kill you, so we're not going to do it.
Well, right, because it's like, okay, they're able to do this technology. They're able to create this technology that actually works. They're able to travel at an infinite velocity and be everywhere at once, right? As Neelix kind of weirdly understands it. I mean, I do like the scene with Neelix where he gives him the idea. But in terms of dramatic complexity, I'm not sure, because they've had a lot of opportunities to send Voyager home and it hasn't happened. So this is not going to be the episode where they get home. I understand that they need to have some sort of a reason why this technology, which is working, is not going to be able to be adapted to Voyager and get them home. But I don't know that turning into lizard people is the way to do that. And again, it just speaks to a fundamental lack of any sort of dramatic interest that was developed in this episode. And
I'm thinking a little bit about the episode last week with C-3PO. What was that episode called?
Prototype.
Well, I'm thinking of last week's episode, Prototype, a little bit, where you have this, we can create this technology, but is it a responsible thing to create this? Do we have the right to do that? And that is a theme that I think could be more interesting with this. Do we have the right to break the barrier of warp 10, even if we can? Again, the episode dodges that question because it's not. Maybe Brannon Braga is not capable of getting to that kind of philosophical depths. We've seen the series go into that kind of a moment, go into that serious.
Yeah.
All right, we have a technology, or we have the possibility of an alliance, or we have we can do this, but will it be going against our principles? And should we just be doing technology for its own sake? I wish this episode had a little more of that kind of a meat to it.
I think you're right, but I also think that at this point in the podcast, we both are probably aware that Brannon Braga is not the writer to do that. Right?
Maybe this episode would have been better pairing him off with someone who could handle it.
Yeah, I don't who could do that on the writing staff? I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure. We've certainly had episodes that deal with interesting moral problems, but I don't know that something this would profoundly change the galaxy is something that the show should even be doing at this point. I mean, it even elides the question of perhaps this technology wouldn't even really be able to be adapted, because the only reason they were able to do this in the first place is because they found some dilithium that was stable at more higher temperature, or whatever the fuck they say. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but it's clean burning coal or whatever. I mean, it doesn't really matter. So we don't even know if they could actually adapt this technology to be used all throughout the Federation. Yeah, I don't know. It's just it's very, very odd. I think that's the best way to approach this episode. It's just it's odd. And I think, yes, the last 5 minutes of the episode are legitimately terrible. I don't know what they were thinking. But
yeah, I feel like if they hadn't had babies, it would be a little less awkward, but I guess I don't really want to deal with the implications of the sex between Lizard Janeway and Lizard Paris. That grosses me out a little bit.
Yeah, and also, why do they have to shoehorn this weird? Because Janeway says, well, maybe it was my idea. Some females of some species are the ones that drive mating, and you're just like, ew. Why are you saying that?
Yeah.
What is going on in your head, Janeway? Why? Is it only because you're the captain? Who cares?
We also got to hear Tom Paris talking about losing his virginity in his bedroom, that he spent all of his time crying and reading books, and I'm like,
yeah, what was that? What was that fundamentally? I don't know why. Oh God, I think
we know we now know that Brannon Braga has devoted time in his life to thinking of the sex lives of the crew of Voyager, and that is a thought that I cannot unthink.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Brannon Braga apparently was a ladies' man, and I use that term very specifically. So maybe that has something to do with it. Let's move far away from the lizard babies, because I don't know that I have much else to say about it, and I'm getting very uncomfortable. So there's two other things that I want to mention about Threshold. Number one, of course, is that we have a second weird shoehorn scene in with crew member Maquis talking to a Kazon. I think this is interesting primarily for two reasons. Number one, it is an ongoing storyline. And two, it is a very, very different way of telling a story that we haven't really seen a Star Trek show do before. It's a very sort of modern feeling storytelling device where you just sort of shoehorn in a scene that has nothing to do with the episode that you're talking about.
Yeah, last week when we had the one scene and it doesn't really nothing came of him his talking to the Kazon. They didn't find out anything from him that they didn't end up finding out on their own later anyway. All he did was really give them a few hours ahead of news. So nothing really came of that. I thought of it as just some crew members are going to go behind the back. Not just Seska is interested in working with the Kazon or doing something else to get out of their situation. Seeing it in this episode again, where nothing really comes of it. We assume if the Kazon are going to adapt this technology, they're not going to be able to. They will be victim to the same things that Tom Paris and Janeway are, and they won't have the expertise to solve it anyway. So it's going to solve itself in a way, but yeah, something is going to come out of that. They have an endpoint for that storyline, and maybe it'll be in the finale, maybe it'll be sooner, I don't know, but something bad is going to happen from this.
Yeah, I think that's pretty obvious that something bad is going to happen, because of course the Kazon are not going to just let Voyager continue on and without having any sort of resolution to that plot line. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but we'll just have to wait and see, I guess. And the last thing I want to mention before we move on to Meld is just a minor observation that the one thing that I guess I've never really noticed about Star Trek Voyager before is that a lot of the characters are extremely snarky, and I kind of like that.
Yeah.
Like Tom Paris is snarky, B'Elanna's snarky, the Doctor is really snarky, Neelix can be kind of snarky. It's an interesting choice. I don't know that there's much to say about it, but it's just something that I've noticed, because that is not really a Star Trek sort of thing.
Maybe it was the era that it was becoming. This is going into the late 90s, became a much more sarcastic time. So this could just be a victim of that. I mean, even DS9 didn't quite go into that, but it was created a little earlier, and I don't know.
I mean, DS9 is a different show with different characters. I just think it's indicative of the fact that maybe a lot of these people don't like each other very much. I'm not sure.
Well, they're not at home. They're not happy, and they aren't. They've lost they still have hope, but they've lost a lot of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, well, let's talk about Meld.
I guess what I think about in this episode is that poor Janeway has to deal 2 weeks in a row with a trusted crew member flipping the fuck out on her. And I feel like this is a recurring theme in Janeway's life. We talked a lot about in TNG, like, oh god, another week where Data gets taken over by a virus or something like that, or it becomes evil. Why do they still let him on? And again, this is another desperation. They can't replace these crew members ever, right? They have to deal with what they get. So even if we have a crew that is very susceptible to turning evil from episode to episode, there's no recourse. I don't know. And I think this episode deals in a very salient way with what do we do to punish people who have done horrible things when we have this particular situation where we can't really get Federation justice as we know it.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, because one of the things that always strikes me about Meld is Tuvok's insistence that they should execute Suter is obviously supposed to indicate his mental state in terms of this idea about Suter's psychopathic murderous tendencies leaking into Tuvok's psyche. And I think that it's interesting only because I could definitely see a different version of this episode that is more about the philosophical underpinnings of is it moral or not to execute someone in when you have such limited resources. And that is not what this episode turns out to be. I don't necessarily have a problem with that, but I just appreciate the fact that the show raises the question, because I do see just in terms of culture and in terms of the kind of debate that we have surrounding capital punishment. And, again, if you're not American, you're probably shaking your head because most civilized countries do not have capital punishment anymore, at least not for the vast majority of crimes. That, the reason why capital punishment was happening in the first place, of course, and why we used to execute people and why places around the world still do, and historically it happened, is because of a lack of resources. You could not afford to keep people around that were not contributing to society. And moreover, they were taking up resources. They were taking up food. They were taking up water, medicine, all these things. And in a society of limited resources, that's not really going to work out very well for anybody.
But I would say there are also some strong philosophical reasons you can't elide completely. You kill somebody because you believe that they cannot be rehabilitated, that they are fully just a bad person, and that they cannot atone for their crime, and so you kill them. I think it makes perfect sense that in the Federation there is no capital punishment, because the Federation is going to find a way to rehabilitate in any case, right? They're going to do their damnedest to figure out a way of getting some use to it. And yes, they do have the advantage of unlimited resource due to matter replication.
I think that some of that is true. Certainly, I do. Just as a devil's advocate, I will say that I do wonder about what the justification for that is. This is kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? Because I think that the idea about criminals as being morally reprehensible and not being able to be rehabilitated could possibly come from the very real material limitations that societies had on their resources. And that is a way to justify or make it sort of morally right to execute people. I think, and again, it's a chicken and egg situation. I think that you could argue both ways, but I just think that the idea of the Federation as, the Federation has the luxury of not executing people. And the Federation also has the luxury of being able to rehabilitate most criminals. Voyager has neither of those, and so what does Voyager do with someone like Suter?
Yeah, and then there is the further question of, even if we're doing that, are we doing that because we've made this cold calculus of our resources are best spent this way, and Suter is okay with this, and are we giving into our desire to punish? Because they certainly Tuvok is dealing with, is he having feelings where he just wants to kill Suter out of punitive reasons, out of bloodlust reasons, or is he doing this out of a sense of justice? And I think that's the other thing. Death penalty can be done just because, well, kill the motherfucker, he killed somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that in terms of there's a couple things going on here, right? Because I think that before Tuvok does the mind meld, of course, he is shocked that someone is murdered on Voyager. Frankly, I don't think that murder is something that generally happens on Starfleet vessels, right? These are men and women that and non-binary species that go through extensive training, that are the best of the best of the best, and the idea that a murder would happen on a Starfleet vessel in this day and age is frankly unthinkable. And especially, and most ships have counselors. Again, Voyager does not have a counselor, and somebody like Suter, if Deanna Troi were on that, she would be meeting with him regularly and dealing with his and getting him the help to discipline his mind. She probably would have put him and Tuvok together
to work together earlier.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, because I think that if they did have a council on board, that everybody would be much better off. But of course, you're talking about a situation where a lot of these people probably have undiagnosed PTSD, and not everybody is a psychopathic murderer like Suter is, but certainly everybody has their own problems. But I do think that the opening of the episode is very striking. This is an idea that is really interesting. I think grapples with some real problems that only Voyager has with the mixing of the Starfleet and Maquis crew. And, once again, we have an episode that undercuts the idea that Voyager was not interested in dealing with the Maquis. I don't think that people remember that Meld dealt with that. And, it's the psychopathic murderer Tuvok is going crazy episode, but it also does come out of a real place of how are the Maquis feeling? How are they interacting with the crew? How are they integrating into Voyager's crew? And
yeah, they asked the question of how are they dealing with Tuvok, which is something they've really not dealt with before, but it is true. A lot of the Maquis knew Tuvok as one of them who betrayed them to Starfleet. So there are going to be some resentments, which I didn't think of.
Yeah, and I don't know that this episode in particular does a lot with it, but I'm not sure that that's the point of this episode. And it's also, I think it's enough that it's raising that as a possibility, because this is kind of a slow burning thing. And I think most of them are probably okay with it only because they have to be. I also think that Suter is not really that upset at Tuvok. I think that Suter is just supposed to be a psychopath.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, we can talk about this, but what's the actor's name who plays Suter? I always forget.
Brad Dourif.
Yeah, he's a very famous character actor that also became famous for playing these sorts of murderous roles. I mean, we did Beyond the Sea a couple months ago at this point on Tuning In, our other podcast. And
from the X-Files.
On the X-Files, yeah, and he played a murderer on that episode. He famously played a murderer on an episode of Babylon 5. He has that kind of demeanor, and he does a very good job with it.
He's very good at playing people who are irredeemable killers, but who are also sites of suffering and struggle and great philosophical and intellectual depth as well. He's always very fascinating to watch. He is very good at this.
So leaving aside the question of Tuvok for a minute, let's examine Suter then as a character, because he is. I mean, well, one of the questions I want to ask you is DS9 was famous for having a very, very strong bench of secondary characters that primarily was due to the fact that, at least that was the theory we had at the time, that came out of the storytelling device and the location of the show, that a stationary space station would have characters there that live there that would just appear over and over again. Voyager is also similarly kind of in that position because it's a very small ship and they have a very small crew, yet we don't have a strong base of secondary characters, and it doesn't seem likely that that's about to happen. I don't think that we're going to have Suter popping up every 5 episodes. I mean, what would they do with that? He's in his quarters for the rest of the trip.
But at the same time, they do put him on. They do end with him existing on the ship and still alive, and I don't think it would be impossible if we have another Suter episode. I don't know either way. If they don't, I will never notice if he never appears again. I will forget about him, but it will be nice to see him again, and the show certainly has that option.
I think it's interesting that you said it'd be nice to see him again, considering he's a murderer. But hey.
No, I always like. Well, I always like watching Brad Dourif work. So
yeah, no, I know what you mean. I like the character a lot, and I think that again, it's a very interesting idea and a very shocking idea to have somebody get murdered on a Starfleet vessel. And I also think that it's a very, very strong choice for the episode to not have this be a murder mystery. Suter is found out very quickly. He confesses very quickly, and everything is fine, and he's in the brig by minute 15. And then, of course, the episode becomes this other episode about Tuvok going through a very, very dramatic change.
Yeah, the two of them switch personalities a little bit, a lot of bit. I mean, I really like seeing the Suter with Vulcan tendencies. Again, I think there is a strong sense of missed opportunity if Tuvok maybe had been Tuvok says at one point, oh, you need to do discipline every single day, and he comes up with certain therapies. The mind meld turns out to be a disaster for the reasons we see in this episode, but if he had not gotten to that point, again, if there had been a counselor on the ship, and...
Well, I think that there's a couple things going on here. I have a question about Tuvok in general, and this is obviously a good place to bring it up because this is a Tuvok episode. Tuvok does this mind meld without asking anybody, and that obviously turned out to not be a great idea. And Janeway, I'm glad that Janeway at the end of the episode basically says, "Don't ever do another mind meld without asking me first." But why do you think Tuvok does this without permission?
Oh, because Tuvok, I wouldn't say he's arrogant or cocky because he is still a Vulcan, but Tuvok has a very strong idea of his abilities. I mean, he especially working with Kes as much as he has, for example, he is all about control of one's abilities, control of one's psyche. And Tuvok is extraordinarily good at control and discipline. And I don't think his estimation of his abilities is incorrect most of the time. With Suitor, I think he's just not prepared for how dark Suitor is. Again, Suitor makes no logical sense to Tuvok. Everybody else on the ship who talks about it can kind of understand, what his sociopathy is, what his tendency to violence is, the way the doctor's explaining it to him, the way Kessin is talking to Tuvok. Tuvok is just totally confused. He doesn't understand somebody who acts outside the bounds of logic this much. Everybody else can say, well, yeah, sometimes somebody has a brain condition where they just snap and kill somebody. It can happen. And so I think Tuvok's inability to understand this darkness is what makes him so susceptible to it when he tries.
I think that's a good theory. I just wonder how realistic it is that Tuvok doesn't apparently understand or even know about the existence of serial killers. I mean, it just strikes me as strange for someone who's a security officer who is basically a trained policeman that has no knowledge of this. And you could ride it or hand wave it by saying that in the Federation they have cured all mental illness, and so serial killers don't exist anymore, and it's a very old fashioned way of looking at things, and they don't study it anymore because X reasons, but it still strikes me as odd.
I think it could legitimately be a blind spot. Again, he's either in Starfleet, where, as you say, people don't get killed very often on Federation vessels, and even in his time at the Maquis, it's kind of implied that...
people get murdered. People don't get murdered. People still get killed.
Fair. Well, yeah, fair enough. Fair distinction. And the Maquis, they make it clear in this episode, people have a lot of outlets for their aggression in the Maquis, and so I think it is possible that, yes, Tuvok just hasn't personally experienced any of this, and while he could read stories about serial killers, he would feel that, well, perhaps there is a motive that was not uncovered in that case. And again, he is in a Federation vessel, and he is seeing somebody who killed, and he feels there has to be a motive. He's incorrect, but...
he's obviously incorrect. There is a motive, though. I mean, the motive is that Suitor is a serial killer. And so I just find it odd that I don't know, there's a weird way that Vulcans are being developed with through the character of Tuvok, where I like the portrayal of Tuvok by Tim Russ. I think that the show, I like to see a main character who's a Vulcan again, but it's turning... I don't know, it seems to have a strange understanding of what Vulcan logic is. And Vulcan logic never struck me as this very, very rigid way of looking at things that... I mean, Tuvok seems almost naively stupid in a way, and that's not how I think of Vulcans.
Well, and especially because I said, I think in some of the earlier episodes, I thought Tuvok was intended to be a lot younger than he is. And... he doesn't act his age sometimes. Is that the hallmark of who Tuvok is?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to respond to that because I don't know if we know how a young Vulcan would respond to this. I mean, I don't, and I don't think that the show thinks that Tuvok is immature. So is this just a case of the show not understanding its own subtext? I'm not really sure. And I don't. It doesn't strike me as immaturity so much as it strikes me as just a lack of logic on the part of the writers. Frankly, I don't know that I can ascribe a coherent motive to this because I don't know that there is one.
Yeah. Again, they're going very much with Vulcans as having strong passions and emotions and having strong darkness and violence in them, but always under control. And again, that is something that has been established about Vulcans that the show is kind of leaning into, but is also kind of viewing that as the dominant interpretation of Vulcans for them.
Right, because I think that this is the first episode that we ever get any sort of indication that there's actually a physical or biochemical way that Vulcans are suppressing their emotions. I mean, in the past, it was always sort of left kind of vague as to how they were doing this. And there apparently is a region of the Vulcan brain that is physically exists and that is biochemically helping them to suppress their emotions. And I also don't know how I feel about that revelation. I mean, again, it's just like it's a good episode. I think that it's a good episode for Tim Russ. It's obviously a very, very striking episode, and it's very, very well done. But there's just some weird things about it that I don't know are very well thought out, especially in terms of the interpretation this episode has of the way that Vulcans exist.
I mean, let's go talk to evolution again. This is like when did the what the hell is his name? Kalas? No, that's the Klingon
Surak.
guy, right? Who is the Surak? When was Surak in the timeline?
Well, I don't know, but I think that, and I guess I'm a bad Trekkie, but they have this. But in the beginning of the episode, I mean, I think it's the point of Neelix talking about Vulcan holidays at the beginning of the episode, of course, because he has him talking about the Caltel season, and Tuvok says, well, there is no Caltel season; it's just a day of meditation. It's very somber, and then Neelix brings up the other one that I didn't write down the name of, but it seems like a much more debauched affair.
The Vulcan Rumeri. It's like a Lupercalia. Yeah, well, either way, these things are within historical memory. This is not.
Yeah, well, that was my point. Is that the what was it called? The Rumeri was. Tuvok says it hasn't been observed for a millennia, so not that.
Yeah,
long ago.
So that is long enough time for a series of disciplines and meditations to be created to where the disciplines of logic can be developed, where all of this can be, if the Vulcan way is mental control, is meditation, is a sense of discipline, in several thousands of years that can be created. An evolution of the brain cannot be created in thousands of years. It's much longer than that. And so I don't buy that the Vulcan brain evolved in the time.
Right. I mean, maybe you could sort of explain this away by saying that the reason Vulcans are able to suppress their emotions is because they had this region of the brain that wasn't used or something. Yeah, who knows? I mean, it's a little bit weird. I think that it's a way for the show to do what it wants to do, which is to show a completely unhinged Vulcan. And it's a very striking scene. It's very well done. I mean, Tim Russ apparently used it in his audition reel because it's a great scene. It showcases his acting abilities very nicely.
And I love how emotional Tuvok is an extension of normal Tuvok. He's not acting completely different.
No.
His speech patterns are the same. And so in a way that kind of retroactively gives us a clue to the range of Tuvok's emotions normally. We see the way he's phrasing certain things, and this is how he's really meaning them, maybe. And that kind of is creepy.
No, I absolutely think it's creepy, and I think that Tim Russ does a really good job with it. I mean, I guess for me, this is a really interesting episode for the ways in which it kind of plays around with our ideas of Vulcans. And, I've already said that I have some problems with the physical or biochemical sort of stuff in the episode, but you just have to kind of go with it for the episode to work. And when
there's a lot of that in this series.
Yeah, we can talk about that at some point. there's a reason why Star Trek Voyager is quote unquote lesser Star Trek. I don't think it's bad necessarily, but it's certainly not as well thought out or as revelatory as some of the earlier shows. That it is the case that this is really the first time, aside from very brief moments of Spock, for example, and I'm thinking of things like the very end of Amok Time, but he's also half human, and so there's that additional complexity there. That this is really the first time that we see a Vulcan who is not suppressing their emotions at all, and it's terrifying. Now I'm
the second time we've seen Sarek when he was extremely ill.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking more of Cybok from Star Trek V, which I don't know what Star Trek V is, so we'll just leave it alone. But
whenever we have seen a Vulcan go emotional, it has been a very bad and a disorder.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, we don't know that this version of Tuvok is the real Tuvok, quote unquote, because he is being affected by the transference of Suitor's psychopathic tendencies, and so there is kind of an indication that this is it's almost like this is a half Suitor, half Tuvok kind of situation in a way, as the calm, collected Suitor is sort of half Suitor, half Tuvok.
Suvok or Tutor.
Yeah, okay. I think that our audience knows why I just made that noise, because there's an episode of the show coming up in just a little while that is going to be very interesting for Richard to see.
Oh, God. Okay, I just want to... Just a completely unrelated side note. I was brushing through the comments on, I think, the 37s, and somebody commented and was saying, by the way, Richard, this is spoilers, so don't read past this point. So, thank you. I like this practice that I would have been spoiled, because I do read the comments. Anyway.
Yes, Richard does read the comments. Don't say he doesn't read the comments. He does read the comments.
Well, I guess there's that one line when they're talking about Suitor at the beginning, and Janeway is all like, well, you let this guy, and Chakotay has this line, well, in the Maquis, we didn't take resumes. And you have to think, like, he had Seska, he had Tuvok, he had Suitor, so, yeah, there's a reason... There's a reason for why you had a lot of traitors on your ship, or people who weren't really working for you. Maybe you really should have taken a resume or asked a question or something like that. Again, my fan theory is that Chakotay's ship wasn't a real Maquis fighter. It was kind of one of the... They were giving it the shit jobs, and they kind of knew that it would be compromised, and so... all right, this will make it a little easier for spies to get on your ship, and now we're not going to give you anything real. That's my theory.
I think that's a good theory.
Especially because, let's face it, Chakotay was new to the Maquis. He had only been in recently at that point because he was taking up his father's.
Yeah, that is true. Well, he may not have been the best Maquis, and I think that that's probably pretty clear for at this point anyway. I just like the idea that the Maquis should take resumes, like... Okay. Well, two things I want to mention before we wrap this episode of the podcast up. So, number one is that Tom Paris is running a gambling operation, and I don't really have anything to say about it. I only mention it because it is somewhat important, and I will leave it at that.
Oh no! Okay, because I wanted to ignore the B plot.
I think it's fair to mostly ignore it. It is only important for a very specific reason that will be revealed at a later time.
Okay, is it that Tom Paris evolves again and becomes Ferengi, and he's Quark in the future, which is how he knew that he was selling the the fake crystals or whatever in the first episode?
Robert McNeil is too tall to be a Ferengi. I'm sorry to say.
Evolution. I mean, he's going to evolve to be shorter.
And the last thing I want to mention is the scene where Tuvok murders the holographic Neelix, which is very, very striking. And it also indicates that perhaps Tuvok is more annoyed by Neelix than he's letting on.
I wonder if he had that program lying around as it is. Like, you gotta figure that, murdering Neelix is something that everybody wants to do at some point. And so there probably is a default holographic program. But then at the same time, that makes you think that there are a lot of programs where you can kill your friends and coworkers, aren't there? Like, that is, everybody says the holodeck, oh, it's just going to be used for porn. No, it's going to be used so you can murder the shit out of your annoying coworkers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe this is why there is no psychopathic tendencies in the Federation, because holographic technology exists, and you can now just murder whoever you want and get it out of your system.
Yeah. These violent video games have their uses.
Well, I think that's it for this episode of the podcast. If you would like to leave your thoughts on either of the episodes of Star Trek Voyager we just watched, Threshold or Meld, please leave a comment on the post for this episode at trekaboutshow.com. You can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/trekaboutshow, which also supports our other podcast, Tuning In. We are releasing our episode on the X-Files, Excelsis Day, and Aubrey on Thursday in just 2 days, so please go to tuninginshow.com and check that out. We are on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Trekabout Show is our username in all those places. And as always, please leave us an iTunes review for Trekabout. It is the best way for new fans to find the show. Next week, we are going to be talking about the Star Trek Voyager episodes Dreadnought and Death Wish. It's D week on Trekabout. And no, I'm not talking about the D.